April 14th, 1943. Over the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, at an altitude of 7,000 feet, Lieutenant James Hoffman checked his fuel gauges for the fifth time in as many minutes. The needles hovered just above empty, and the vast expanse of ocean stretched in every direction. The 26-year-old pilot of the United States Army Air Forces was absolutely certain that he would be making his final landing in the unforgiving waters below within the hour. The experimental fuel mixture in his tanks, a concoction that his superior officers would have court-martialed him for using, was about to be proven worthless in the most final way possible. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one pilot's desperate gamble with an unauthorized fuel formula not only saved his life, but would ultimately transform the operational capabilities of Allied air power, extending the range of aircraft across the European theater and saving thousands of lives in a way that neither the brass in Washington nor the engineers at Standard Oil could have predicted. Lieutenant Hoffman had not planned to be a test pilot that day, especially not 300 miles from the nearest friendly airfield, with a rainstorm developing on the horizon. As the navigator for a routine transport mission in a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, he had expected an uneventful flight from Prestwick, Scotland to Reykjavik, Iceland, ferrying critical radio equipment. The original pilot, Captain Lawrence Sullivan, had fallen violently ill with food poisoning minutes before takeoff, leaving Hoffman, who had piloting experience but mainly served as navigator, to take command. "You sure you can handle her, Jimmy?" asked Technical Sergeant Walter Prescott, the flight engineer, as they completed the pre-flight checks in the pre-dawn darkness. The sergeant's weathered face carried the skepticism of a man who had seen too many young officers overestimate their abilities. "Of course I can handle her," Hoffman replied with the practiced confidence of someone determined not to reveal their doubts. "I logged over 300 hours on this model back in training." What Lieutenant Hoffman omitted was that those hours had been logged nearly 2 years earlier, and almost exclusively in the forgiving skies over Nebraska, not the unpredictable conditions of the North Atlantic, where visibility could drop to 0 in minutes, and navigation errors meant death. Sergeant Prescott tightened his lips but nodded. "The spare parts in the cargo hold have shifted the weight distribution. She'll pull slightly to port. Fuel calculations are tight but adequate if we maintain optimal cruise speed and altitude." These words would later come back to haunt them both. The flight began smoothly enough. The Douglas transport rumbled down the runway at Prestwick and lifted into the grey Scottish dawn. The first 2 hours passed without incident as they climbed to their cruising altitude of 8,000 feet, settling into the monotonous drone of the twin Pratt & Whitney R1300 engines. The weather report had promised clear skies until they reached Iceland, with moderate winds from the northwest. As was often the case with North Atlantic forecasts during the war, the report proved hopelessly optimistic. 3 hours into the flight, dark clouds began building ahead, much sooner than predicted. Hoffman's training told him to maintain course and altitude, but the rapidly deteriorating visibility forced him to descend to 5,000 feet to stay beneath the cloud cover. The change in altitude increased their fuel consumption beyond the carefully calculated margins. Worse still, the headwinds had intensified to nearly 40 knots, nearly double what had been forecast. "We're burning too much fuel," Prescott said, his voice tight with concern as he studied the gauge readings. "At this rate, we'll be 20 minutes short of Reykjavik." Corporal Dennis Woodbridge, the radio operator, looked up from his station. "Should I request diversion to a closer airfield, sir?" Hoffman checked his navigation charts again. "There isn't one, Corporal. Not unless you'd like to drop in on the Germans in occupied Norway." The grim humor fell flat as the aircraft encountered the first pocket of turbulence, causing the Douglas to shudder and drop several hundred feet before Hoffman could compensate. The three men exchanged glances, their faces illuminated briefly by a flash of lightning in the distance. It was at this moment that Sergeant Prescott cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, I might have a suggestion." "It's unorthodox, sir, technically against regulations." Hoffman raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening, Sergeant." "I worked at the Sinclair refinery in Oklahoma before enlisting. Learned a few things about aviation fuel." Prescott hesitated. I have a formula that can increase our range by stretching what we have left. A formula? What are you talking about? Prescott explained that while stationed in North Africa 6 months earlier, he had observed Royal Air Force mechanics adding small amounts of cooking oil and methylated spirits to their Hurricane fighters' fuel tanks when supplies ran critically low during desert operations. The mixture had allowed the aircraft to fly significantly farther than their fuel gauges suggested possible. The RAF kept it quiet. Higher-ups would have had a fit about engine damage, but it worked in emergencies. "I've got the proportions memorized," Prescott said. "You're suggesting we dump cooking oil from the mess supplies into our fuel tanks?" "That's insane," Hoffman replied. "Not just cooking oil, sir. We need the methylated spirits too. And we'd need to adjust the mixture ratios in flight." Corporal Woodbridge's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. We'll flame out over the ocean." Hoffman was about to dismiss the idea outright when a violent downdraft struck the aircraft, forcing him to wrestle with the controls. When they stabilized, he glanced at the fuel gauges again. The situation had deteriorated further. "How confident are you in this formula, Sergeant?" Hoffman asked, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "Confident enough to bet my life on it, sir, which I suppose I am." Lieutenant James Hoffman was the son of a chemistry professor from Cornell University. While he had chosen military service over following his father's academic path, he had absorbed enough scientific knowledge growing up to understand the basic principles at work in Prescott's proposal. The mixture might indeed extend their range by creating a more efficient burn, but it could also damage the engines irreparably or cause them to fail catastrophically. With another glance at the fuel gauges and the storm intensifying around them, Hoffman made his decision. "Let's do it." The next 20 minutes were a flurry of activity. Prescott retrieved cooking oil from their ration supplies, while Woodbridge located a small container of methylated spirits kept for emergency radio equipment maintenance. Working with precise measurements dictated by Prescott, they created the makeshift fuel additive. The real challenge came in adding it to the fuel system in flight. This required Prescott to access panels in the rear of the aircraft, carefully introducing the mixture into the fuel lines in small increments, while Hoffman adjusted the engine controls to compensate for the changing fuel properties. "Easy on the throttle, Lieutenant," Prescott called through the intercom. "The mixture's thicker. Needs a leaner burn than standard." Hoffman followed the instructions, his hands making minute adjustments as the engine's pitch changed subtly. For several tense minutes, both power plants coughed and sputtered, causing the aircraft to lurch uncomfortably. Woodbridge gripped his seat, his knuckles white, clearly expecting the engines to die at any moment. But they didn't. Instead, after a period of rough running, both engines settled into a smooth rhythm. The fuel gauges still showed critical levels, but the consumption rate had noticeably slowed. "It's working," Prescott announced, returning to the cockpit with a tentative smile. "But we're not out of trouble yet. We need to maintain this exact power setting and pray the weather gives us a break." The weather, however, had other plans. The storm cell they had observed earlier had intensified and expanded, forming a wall of turbulent air directly in their path. Attempting to fly around it would consume precious fuel they couldn't spare. Flying through it would subject the aircraft and their experimental fuel mixture to extreme stress. "Reykjavik Tower, this is Army Transport 47906, Woodbridge called on the radio, requesting emergency weather update and approach vectors. The only response was crackling static. They were still too far out for reliable radio contact, and the storm was likely interfering with transmission. "We're on our own," Hoffman stated simply. "Prepare for turbulence." The next 90 minutes were among the most harrowing any of the men had experienced. The Douglas transport pitched and rolled through violent air currents. Rain lashed against the cockpit windows with such force that visibility was reduced to mere yards, and ice began forming on the wings despite the aircraft's modest de-icing capabilities. Throughout it all, Hoffman maintained a death grip on the controls, fighting to keep the aircraft level, while constantly monitoring the engine performance for any sign that their jury-rigged fuel mixture was failing. Prescott moved between the cockpit and the engines, making adjustments to the mixture controls as needed, while Woodbridge continued his attempts to establish radio contact with Iceland. 4 hours into the flight, when they should have been preparing for landing in Reykjavik, they remained at least 200 miles from their destination, according to Hoffman's dead reckoning. The fuel gauges now showed empty, yet the engines continued to run, drawing on the last reserves in the tanks supplemented by their controversial mixture. "By all rights, we should be swimming right now," Woodbridge observed, his initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. "Don't celebrate yet," Prescott warned. "The mixture seems to be working, but I'm seeing unusual pressure readings. We're pushing these engines beyond their design limits." As if to punctuate his concerns, the starboard engine suddenly misfired, causing the aircraft to yaw sharply. Hoffman corrected with rudder input, his jaw set in concentration. "What happened?" he demanded. Prescott was already moving toward the rear access panels. "Fuel flow interruption. The mixture might be separating or clogging the lines. I need to adjust the formula." For the next half hour, Prescott worked feverishly to modify their approach, slightly increasing the ratio of methylated spirits to counteract what he suspected was precipitation of the cooking oil in the colder, high-altitude temperatures. Meanwhile, Hoffman nursed the engines along, reducing power to the minimum needed to maintain altitude. Their salvation came in the form of a break in the clouds and a crackling voice over the radio. "Army Transport 47906, this is Reykjavik Tower. We read you weak but clear. State your position and situation." Woodbridge nearly shouted with relief as he responded, providing their estimated position based on Hoffman's calculations. 47906. Be advised our radar shows you approximately 180 miles southeast of Reykjavik. Weather is clearing in your sector but deteriorating here. Recommend immediate course correction to heading 340. The news was both encouraging and alarming. They had made better progress than Hoffman had estimated, but they were off course, likely due to the strong crosswinds they'd been battling. The new heading would correct their track, but it would also increase their total distance to Reykjavik. "Tower, be advised we are operating on emergency fuel reserves," Hoffman transmitted. "Request priority landing and emergency services on standby." "Understood, 47906. You are cleared direct to Reykjavik. Priority handling. Can you make the field?" Hoffman looked to Prescott, who shrugged. "By conventional calculations, no, but we should have been down an hour ago, so who knows. Tower will do our damnedest," Hoffman replied. The final approach to Reykjavik was an exercise in precision flying and fuel management. With both engines now running on fumes and their experimental mixture, Hoffman had to balance the need for speed against the risk of exhausting their fuel completely. Every unnecessary movement of the controls, every foot of altitude lost and regained, represented precious fuel consumed. As they descended through 5,000 feet, with the coast of Iceland finally visible on the horizon, the port engine began to run rough. Prescott immediately adjusted the mixture controls, leaning the fuel flow to extract every possible mile from their remaining supply. "We're going to make it," Woodbridge said, his voice reflecting the disbelief they all felt. "Don't jinx us," Hoffman replied, though a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. At 3,000 feet, with Reykjavik's runway now visible in the distance, the starboard engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The sudden asymmetric thrust caused the Douglas to veer sharply right. Hoffman compensated with full left rudder and aileron, fighting to maintain a controlled descent with only one functioning engine. "Feather the starboard prop," he ordered Prescott, who quickly complied, reducing the drag from the dead engine. "Reykjavik Tower, we've lost an engine," Woodbridge reported, continuing approach. The remaining engine groaned under the strain as Hoffman coaxed the transport toward the runway. Their descent rate increased, forcing him to make constant adjustments to avoid coming in too steep or too fast. 2 miles from the threshold, at 1,000 feet, the port engine finally surrendered, its fuel supply exhausted beyond even the miraculous extension provided by Prescott's mixture. The propeller windmilled as the aircraft transformed from a powered vehicle to a very heavy glider. "Brace for impact," Hoffman called calmly, though his hands were anything but calm on the controls as he worked to maintain the optimal glide angle. In complete silence, except for the wind whistling around the airframe, the Douglas C-47 descended toward runway 20 at Reykjavik. Hoffman's world narrowed to the rectangle of concrete, growing larger in the windscreen. Too high, and they would overshoot into the bay beyond. Too low, and they would fall short, likely striking the seawall that protected the approach end of the runway. The aircraft crossed the threshold at precisely the right height, but traveling faster than optimal for landing. With no power to go around, Hoffman had no choice but to commit. The transport touched down hard, bounced once, then settled onto the runway with a screech of tires. With no engines to power the hydraulic brakes, Hoffman had to rely on mechanical backup systems, pumping the brake pedals furiously as they careened down the runway. For a moment, it seemed they would run out of concrete before running out of momentum. But the Douglas gradually slowed and rolled to a stop, less than 300 feet from the end of the runway. As fire trucks and emergency vehicles raced toward them, the three airmen sat in stunned silence, the realization of what they had accomplished slowly dawning on them. 500 miles, Prescott finally said. By my calculations, we flew nearly 500 miles after our fuel gauges hit empty. Lieutenant Hoffman nodded, his hands still gripping the control yoke, despite the aircraft being stationary. And violated about a dozen regulations in the process. Worth it to avoid swimming in the North Atlantic, sir, Woodbridge added with a nervous laugh. None of them could have predicted how this desperate improvisation would reverberate beyond their survival. The debrief in Reykjavik was predictably intense. Major Harold Whitaker, the base operations officer, was initially furious at what he perceived as reckless endangerment of both crew and aircraft. You introduced an unauthorized, untested substance into a military aircraft's fuel system, he bellowed, his face reddening beneath his cropped grey hair. Do you have any idea of the potential consequences? The engines could have exploded. You could have poisoned yourselves with fumes. Hoffman stood at attention, accepting responsibility. Yes, sir, it was my decision as aircraft commander. Technical Sergeant Prescott provided the formula, but I gave the order to proceed. And saved all our lives, sir, Woodbridge added, earning a sharp look from both Hoffman and the Major. What changed the trajectory of the meeting, and ultimately, of Allied aviation strategy, was the arrival of Group Captain Nigel Farthington of the Royal Air Force. The British officer had been in Reykjavik coordinating joint operations when he overheard discussion of the American transport's improbable arrival. You say you flew how many miles beyond your expected fuel exhaustion? He asked, his interest clearly piqued. Approximately 500 miles, sir, Hoffman replied. The group captain exchanged glances with Major Whitaker, and this was achieved with a mixture of standard aviation fuel supplemented with cooking oil and methylated spirits? Prescott stepped forward. Yes, sir, in precise proportions, adjusted for temperature and altitude. I learned the basic formula from RAF ground crews in North Africa. Farthington's eyebrows rose. Did you indeed? Most interesting. Those resourceful chaps were ordered to discontinue that practice after concerns about engine longevity. With respect, sir, Prescott countered, in an emergency situation, engine longevity becomes a secondary consideration to immediate survival. A slow smile spread across the group captain's face. Quite right, Sergeant, quite right indeed. He turned to Major Whitaker. I believe we should examine their engines before passing judgment. If the damage is minimal, this could have significant implications. The detailed inspection of the Douglas's engines revealed something unexpected. While there was evidence of higher-than-normal combustion temperatures and some unusual deposit patterns, the overall condition was remarkably good, considering the stress they had been subjected to. The manufacturer's representative, hastily flown in from England, was cautiously intrigued rather than horrified. I wouldn't recommend this as standard practice, the Pratt & Whitney technician concluded. But for emergency use, it's less destructive than I would have predicted. With some refinement to the formula and proper testing, there might be something here worth pursuing. That something became the focus of intense interest at the highest levels of Allied Air Command. Within 2 weeks, Lieutenant Hoffman and Sergeant Prescott found themselves at RAF Farnborough in England, working with a team of fuel chemists and engine specialists to recreate and refine their emergency mixture under controlled conditions. Captain Miles Albright, head of the RAF's Experimental Fuels Division, was initially skeptical. You realize that we've had teams of scientists working on fuel efficiency problems since before the war began, and you expect us to believe that a sergeant with refinery experience stumbled upon a solution they missed. Not stumbled, sir, Prescott corrected respectfully. Adapted. The base principles were already known in the petroleum industry, but considered too risky for aircraft application. Our emergency demonstrated that the risks might be acceptable under certain conditions. The first controlled tests were conducted on stationary engines, carefully monitoring performance, temperature and wear patterns. The results were promising enough to warrant flight testing, first in single-engine trainers and later in operational aircraft including Spitfires, Hurricanes, and American P-51s. By June 1943, a modified version of what had become known informally as Hoffman-Prescott mix was being tested for operational use in specific mission profiles. The key breakthrough came not from using the mixture for the entire flight, which indeed caused excessive engine wear, but from switching to it during the return leg of long-range missions when aircraft were lighter and could operate at more optimal power settings. The implications for bomber operations were particularly significant. Major General Frederick Anderson of the 8th Air Force became a champion of the approach after seeing preliminary results. "Gentlemen," he told a gathering of squadron commanders, "this development could allow our bombers to reach targets currently beyond their operational radius, or alternatively, to carry heavier bomb loads to existing targets. The strategic value is incalculable." Not everyone was convinced. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, had reservations about engine reliability and maintenance implications. "I will not authorize widespread use until we have absolutely conclusive evidence that the long-term effects are manageable," he insisted. One thing to risk an aircraft already in an emergency situation, quite another to deliberately place hundreds of aircraft and their crews at risk. The matter might have remained in experimental limbo indefinitely had it not been for the events of August 19, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave, the daring low-level bombing raid against the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, had resulted in heavy American losses, with 53 B-24 Liberators lost out of 177 dispatched. Many of those losses came from aircraft running out of fuel during the return journey after sustaining battle damage. In the aftermath of this costly mission, General Henry Hap Arnold personally authorized accelerated field testing of the extended range formula. By September, a refined version was being used selectively by heavy bombers operating at the extreme edge of their range. For James Hoffman and Walter Prescott, the validation of their desperate improvisation came with both recognition and new responsibilities. Hoffman was promoted to captain and assigned to the newly formed Long-Range Development Unit at Wright Field in Ohio. Prescott received a battlefield commission to second lieutenant and joined the technical liaison team, working between the Army Air Forces and fuel production facilities. The most dramatic demonstration of the mixture's strategic impact came during the Berlin bombing campaign of early 1944. Flying from bases in eastern England, American B-17 flying fortresses were able to carry full bomb loads deeper into Germany while maintaining adequate fuel reserves for the return journey. This extended range capability forced the Luftwaffe to disperse its fighter defenses over a wider area, reducing their effectiveness against the bomber streams. German intelligence eventually became aware of the Allied range extension capabilities, though they initially attributed it to external fuel tanks or reduced bomb loads rather than fuel composition changes. By the time they understood the true nature of the innovation, the strategic bombing campaign had already devastated German industrial capacity. The human dimension of this technical achievement was brought home to Captain Hoffman during a visit to an 8th Air Force base in April 1944. After briefing bomber crews on the latest refinements to the mixture procedures, he was approached by a young ball turret gunner. "Sir," the airman said, extending his hand, "I just wanted to thank you. Last month, we took flak over Brunswick that punctured 2 fuel cells. By all rights, we should have gone down in the North Sea. Your fuel mix got us home." "How many missions have you completed, Sergeant?" Hoffman asked. "That was my 23rd, sir. Just 2 more to go." The knowledge that his improvisation had helped this young man, and countless others like him, come home alive affected Hoffman deeply. What had begun as a desperate gamble to save 3 lives had expanded to save hundreds, perhaps thousands. By the war's end, the modified fuel mixture procedures had been incorporated into standard operating practices for long-range aircraft throughout the Allied forces. The formula itself underwent several refinements, eventually evolving into specialized fuel additives that increased efficiency without the original mixture's drawbacks. In the post-war years, elements of the technology found their way into commercial aviation and even automotive applications. The fundamental insights about fuel-air mixture optimization under various operating conditions influenced engine design for decades to come. James Hoffman remained in the newly established United States Air Force after the war, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1967 after a distinguished career focused on aviation logistics and fuel systems development. Walter Prescott returned to the petroleum industry, where he helped pioneer synthetic fuel technologies using principles derived from their wartime innovation. Perhaps the most telling epilogue came in 1958, when a fuel system engineer at Boeing cited the Hoffman-Prescott work as influential in the development of the fuel management systems for the new 707 jetliner, the aircraft that would help usher in the age of mass commercial aviation. From a desperate gamble over the North Atlantic to the foundations of modern air travel, all because three men refused to accept the limitations of their fuel gauges and conventional thinking. Their story remains a powerful reminder that innovation often emerges not from comfortable laboratories, but from the pressure of survival and the willingness to challenge established boundaries. When Lieutenant James Hoffman checked his fuel gauges on that stormy April day in 1943, he saw certain doom in the needle's position near empty. What he could not see was how his decision to try something illegal would ultimately change the course of aerial warfare and save countless lives. The Douglas C-47 that should have plunged into the North Atlantic instead became the unlikely birthplace of an aviation breakthrough, proving once again that necessity truly is the mother of invention, especially when coupled with knowledge, courage, and the willingness to break a few rules when survival depends on it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.